Our last source of genetic variation that we're going to talk about is gene flow. This is the exchange of genetic material between populations of the same species. And so alleles are able to spread through gene flow even when selection's not operating on the allele. We can see, for example, eye color changing or hair texture changing, even when there's not, let's say, an ecological impetus for selection favoring that particular trait. So, for example, curly hair. When we look back at kind of the origins of curly hair, this had a benefit in arid savanna environments. The tight kind of kink that we see among black populations with their hair, what it does is it lifts the hair itself up off of the scalp, which creates this kind of area for ventilation. It's kind of like a swamp cooler, really. That when the hair is lifted off of the scalp, it's able to, airflow is able to cool your head, which when you think about your brain, if your brain starts to increase in body temperature and brain temperature, it's going to kill it off. So that kind of kink in the hair was favored as hominins were evolving in Africa because of that really kind of importance of keeping heads cool. As we moved out of Africa and as we innovated clothing and hats and things like that, we relaxed that selection pressure on that kind of hair. Well, in modern populations, we see that kind of tight kink present even in people who don't classify themselves as black. And so we can see kind of the evidence of interbreeding of people with kinky curly hair mating with people who have straight hair, and some of their offspring having curly hair. There's not environmental selection pressures favoring tight kinky hair if you happen to find yourself in, I don't know, the northeast of the United States. However, we still see alleles spreading through the population because of the gene flow, because of genetic admixture. And as we've increased the movement of human populations around the globe, we're seeing alleles spread even wider. So, we had a decline with skin color or hair texture, with nose shapes prior to European colonialism. Once colonialism and imperialism started, because Europeans would rape and pillage populations as they encountered them, we saw the spread of European traits throughout tropical populations. But that happened at a pace that wasn't quite as paralleled as modern day gene flow. Now, it would have taken months to years then to go from one continent to another. Now we're able to circumnavigate the globe in a manner of, really only about a day and a half, 2 days. So we are seeing rates of gene flow that are really unparalleled. We're seeing a genetic mixing of the population that really goes to negate racial classification. We'll talk about race later. Race is something that is culturally constructed and used strategically for access to key critical resources, cultural domination. To keep others from having access to those resources. It's not something that's biologically based, and we see more variation between races, or more variation within races, I'm sorry, within racial categories than we see between races. So with ever increasing genetic admixture, that's only going to become more true, that we are a global population. We are one race, the human race, as corny as that sounds. All right, so this aspect of gene flow relates to our definition of species. We consider populations the same species if they are able to interbreed and they produce offspring that are viable and fertile. That means their offspring live and their offspring reproduce. We distinguish or define populations as separate species when they either cannot interbreed. For some insects, for example, there's a lock and key kind of mechanism. The penis is a certain shape that fits into it's not called a vagina in like spiders and insects, but the opening into the female reproductive tract. That there's a very particular shape kind of key that goes with each lock. And so among insects that look the same to our untrained eye that are technically separate species, the penis may not fit, so they may not be able to actually successfully reproduce. But we can also have a situation where they're quite capable of at least having intercourse, but then their offspring are either subviable or subfertile. Think about donkeys and horses, for example. When you mate a donkey with a horse, you get a mule. Mules are quite able to live. They're certainly viable, but they're generally sterile. There's only been one mule in the past 40 years who's had any offspring, and that happened only about 4 or 5 years ago. We get the same thing with zebras and horses. You get a zorse. Zorses are subfertile. Same thing with lions and tigers. You get a liger, and ligers are often infertile. So gene flow tends to prevent speciation or the formation of new species unless subgroups of the same species are separated for a sufficient length of time. So when we isolate populations, we've got the potential then for speciation events. That brings us then to this distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. There are two ends of a continuum of evolutionary change. Macroevolution is also called phyletic evolution. This is small-scale genetic change in a population or a species over a few, several, or even many generations, but without speciation. You're changing the way species look, the way their physiology is, the way they behave, but you're not generating a new species. Macroevolution happens on a larger scale or may involve more significant changes in a population or species. Usually this happens over a longer time period. This then results in speciation. So we can think of macroevolution occurring because of accumulated microevolution combined with genetic isolation. Both happen in the same way and for the same reasons through natural selection. So we're going to look at one example of phyletic or microevolution. This is with the peppered moth. This is widely used in introbiology texts and really has to do with what the population looked like prior to industrialization in England and after industrialization in England. So the peppered moth is found in Great Britain and throughout Europe. It has two color variants. There is the peppered or speckled variant, which is gray and has kind of spots all over it, and there's the melanistic variant, which is black. Prior to industrialization, the trees in the forests in England were kind of speckled in color because of lichens that grew on the tree trunks. So you may have had a gray bark with greenish gray lichens. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between algae and other fungi, and kind of result in a kind of flaky covering on the tree. After industrialization, because of coal-fired plants, the tree trunks became black because of the deposition of soot. So I've got two pictures here. One is a tree covered in lichens, one is a tree covered in soot. At both points in time, we had those two variants of moths. We had the peppered or speckled variant, and we had the melanistic variant. The mechanism of natural selection here is bird predation. So you're a bird flying through the air, you're looking at trees, and you're trying to find a moth to eat. Prior to industrialization, with this picture on the left, which of those two moths would you have seen more easily? That's right, you would have seen the melanistic variant. So as a bird, you would have eaten it. That means that the peppered or speckled variant would have survived at higher rates and would have gone on to reproduce. So we had a population kind of proportional representation that was predominantly peppered or speckled variants and relatively few melanistic variants. Fast forward a few years, we've got coal-fired plants, we've got the deposition of soot on tree trunks, we've got higher pollution. Now you're a bird flying through the forest, you're looking down at trees. This is the picture on the right. Which of those moths would you see and would you eat? That's right, it's the peppered or the speckled variant. And so very abruptly, we see a change in the proportional representation of those two variants of moths. After the Industrial Revolution, suddenly the population shifted pretty dramatically to where most of the moths were the melanistic variety and very few of them were the peppered variety. If we had enough time and we had a pristine forest that didn't have any um, any deposition of soot whatsoever, we might see a species that goes to fixation with this peppered or speckled variant. Similarly, if we had a forest that was polluted and stayed polluted and we didn't innovate new forms of firing our factories, powering our factories, we might see a population that goes to fixation with this black or speckled variant. Eventually, that might lead to a speciation event. It hasn't, though, because we don't generally use coal anymore to fire industrial production. Plus, throughout much of Western Europe and the United States, we've shifted our industry now to developing countries like China, like Vietnam, like countries in South America. So we are no longer doing that kind of industrial production that led to pollution, or if we are running industry, we're using electricity to power our plants, and we're not burning coal for that, we're burning natural gas, whatever the case may be. So we haven't isolated those populations. We haven't seen speciation. There are still two color variants of peppered moths. We do see a speciation event that has happened relatively close to us. The Isthmus of Panama, for example, arose 3 million years ago. Prior to that point, we didn't have a bridge that connected North and South America. We had one species of what we call snapping shrimp that lived in the Atlantic, lived in the Pacific, lived in this area between North and South America. Suddenly, or relatively suddenly in geological time, about 3 million years ago, we get the Isthmus of Panama that isolated the snapping shrimp on either side of that isthmus. So now we have a distinct Atlantic population and a distinct Pacific population. Look at their claws. Okay, what we see is on the Atlantic side, three different species that are all right-handed. What I mean by that is that snapping shrimp have one claw that is about twice as large as the other one. On the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama, all of those species of snapping shrimp are right-clawed. It's the right claw that is the enlarged claw. On the Pacific side, all three species are left-clawed. So we have very quickly, based on a founding effect, some genetic drift, and then genetic isolation, seen isolation of left and right-handed snapping shrimp that over the past 3 million years have given rise to distinct populations that now can't interbreed. So when there's genetic isolation, when there are rapidly changing environments that are selecting for certain traits, we can have very quick speciation events. People often point out the squirrels that are isolated on the north rim of the Grand Canyon versus those all along the south rim. There are isolated populations of squirrels that only arose because of genetic isolation once the canyon got deep enough. So we can see speciation kind of in situ. We can see speciation occurring. The problem is, of course, the time scale, right? If we are in the lab and we sample a population genetically and we sequence their DNA and have their proportions of alleles that are in that population, that's just going to be just that, a snapshot. It's going to be one moment in a very long string of moments of evolutionary change. So if we talk about speciation, if we talk about life surviving and reproducing, we also have to talk about extinction. Many species can survive radical environmental shifts. However, speciation is a more common result, particularly when species are well suited to certain aspects of the environment. When that environment then shifts, we see those species die. We've seen several mass extinctions over the history of life on Earth. Speciation may respond to many factors. The rate of environmental change. If environmental change is gradual, then we're going to see gradual change in species. If environmental change is very abrupt, then we may see extinction and then what we call adaptive radiation, very rapidly new species appearing. It can also respond to the speed with which geographical barriers rise or fall. If they rise or fall very slowly, we've got more genetic admixture. If they're very abrupt, like let's say a volcano forming a new island or an earthquake leading to a rift, then we might see extinction or we might see more rapid speciation. The degree of competition with other species affects speciation. This is something that is true for Darwin's finches, and this is what is informing your learning activity for this week. You will be engaging in an experiment that's meant to model the diversification of finch beaks in the Galapagos. Darwin noted, as he was working as a ship's naturalist on the Beagle, that on large islands there were multiple species of birds, and those birds had very distinct beak shapes. So on large islands, you might have even as many as 3 or 4 different species of finch. On small islands, you generally only had one species of finch. Well, what those different beak shapes did was allow those finch populations to specialize on different resources. So on a large island, you might have a finch that could eat seeds, kind of like our house finches or goldfinches. You might have a finch with a long, curved, slender beak that's able to get nectar out of cactus flowers. You might have a beak that's very sharp and pointy that's able to puncture the skin of the cactus itself to get at things that are inside. You might have a beak that's really thick and robust that's able to crack nuts or seeds that are much more hard-shelled. So when there's a high degree of feeding competition, we might see rapid diversification of species. And then also the effectiveness of the group's adaptive response. I mean, we can think about animals that only eat one thing. The koala with eucalyptus, for example. If the environment shifts, which it's doing in Australia, and eucalyptus trees are being cut down, and there's an increase of what we call desertification, where more of Australia is being converted to desert, what's going to happen to koalas? They're not going to adapt and eat something different. Instead, they're going to go extinct. The same thing was true with giant pandas. The same thing is true for many of the populations of lemurs that are present on the island of Madagascar as humans have encroached and disturbed habitat and their food sources have gone extinct. The animals then go extinct. And so over the Earth's history, we've seen a series of extinction events that result in a lot of fossils and clear demarcation in our geological evolution. So around 439 million years ago, we lost 86% of life on Earth. All of that life was aquatic. So as the water froze and as sea levels fell, those species were wiped out. Around 364 million years, we had land plants that released nutrients into oceans and caused algal blooms. We lost about 75% of ocean species during that event, and we also saw volcanic ash cooling Earth's temperatures, which killed off many of the spiders and scorpion-type creatures that were on land. About 251 million years ago, 96% of all species were lost because of a volcanic eruption that filled the air with carbon dioxide. This led to large amounts of methane, and so the environment, the atmosphere, rapidly shifted. The Earth warmed, oceans became acidic, so we lost both land and sea life. The Triassic or Jurassic extinction. Between 199 million years ago and 214 million years ago, the asteroid impact led to climate change. During the beginning of this era, mammals outnumbered dinosaurs. By the end of the era, dinosaurs reigned supreme. Then again, we've got this Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. Volcanic activity, asteroid impact, climate change led to 76% of life on Earth dying 65 million years ago. This is critical. This is critical for the emergence of primates. This is critical for the evolution of humans. Okay, when these large reptiles died off, when the dinosaurs went extinct, this opened up the Earth for diversification of birds and mammals. There's another thing that happened 65 million years ago at the same time that we're seeing birds and mammals diversify. This is the point where we see the evolution of flowering plants. trees, shrubs, etc., that produce flowers and then produce fruit. Think about your stereotypical monkey. What do monkeys eat? I mean, hopefully your mind went right to bananas, right? Monkeys are associated with eating bananas. It's not just bananas, it's all fruits. But this is what drove the adaptive radiation of primates. It was the dinosaurs going extinct and then the flowering plants spreading throughout this new environment. We started off as plant eaters, as fruit eaters. We evolved from populations of fruit eating proto-human, proto-apes that were living in African tropical forests. And then I've got another one listed down here, the Anthropocene. This is the name for the current extinction event that we are experiencing. If you look at the background extinction rates over the past 500 years, we've got a pretty consistent rate of extinction for all species, including mammals, birds, vertebrates, fish, reptiles, and amphibians, until the Industrial Revolution. So what is it from the Industrial Revolution on that has led to the Anthropocene? Well, we're changing the habitat. And critically, we are seeing global climate change. As the Earth's temperatures rise, we're going to see more extinction events. As we consume larger quantities of natural resources, critically things like forests, we're going to see mass extinction events. We are losing species at an unprecedented rate. We are there are about 1,000 species that are at risk every decade now of going extinct. Many of these we're not going to notice because they're not species like the dodo, or they're not species like the giant ground sloth. Many of them are going to be insects, plants, fungi, frogs. Frogs are the canary of the rainforest. You know, the canary of the coal miners would carry. They'd take a canary down into the coal mines with them. And if the bird stopped singing and died, they would know that the air was dangerous to breathe and that they would soon stop breathing as well. And so they knew to get the heck out of there. Well, frogs are the indicator species for the health of forests, and we are losing frogs at an unprecedented rate, which influences higher taxa as well and kind of influences our global ecology. So in summary, know the key dimensions of Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution by natural selection. Consider the influence of uniformitarianism and how that's going to inform subsequent research into human evolution and other fields. Compare and contrast evolution by natural selection with things like creationism and catastrophism. Know the importance of Mendel's experiments. Know some of the terminology like heterozygous and homozygous, genotype and phenotype. Know their implications for evolution. You know, the key contribution was this idea of heredity and how heredity happens. Be familiar with the subject matter of population genetics. Well, what I mean there is just knowing that evolution is change in gene frequencies over time, that we're measuring evolution at the population level, while selection is using phenotypes and selecting at the individual level, and then be able to distinguish these key mechanisms of genetic evolution, particularly mutation and sexual recombination, and the role that each mechanism plays in evolution.